If Yegor were asked now about the worst thing that had ever happened in his life, he would probably remember that memorable trip to the village. At the time, he had just turned 18 and was in his first year at the local university. He didn't want to go to that remote, mountainous wilderness, but the upcoming wedding of his cousin forced him to. "Dad, can't I avoid going somehow? I haven't seen my sister in over 10 years, and I don't think I'll have anything to talk to her about," Yegor asked cautiously. Sergei Yegorovich looked at his son in surprise and then shook his head. "No, our son doesn't do that. It's customary to go, and you'll have to," his father replied. Saying that Yegor was upset would be an understatement. And what was even more frustrating was that, at the last crucial moment, his parents canceled their plans to go, leaving him to face this wilderness alone. They would stay home for the weekend while he was being sent off, as he thought with sadness. Yegor had to take the train to get to his destination. Initially, his father had offered to take him to the station in Korovin, but then he changed his mind, using work as an excuse. At 18, Yegor had never attended a wedding, let alone a village one. He had no idea what to expect, but his best friend Maxim jokingly warned him, "Be careful out there. Every second person's armed with a crowbar or pitchfork." Over the 10 years since Yegor had last been to the village, everything had changed. First, the number of abandoned houses had increased drastically, making up nearly half the buildings. Almost all the wells had dried up, and the river had noticeably shrunk. The sight was quite depressing, and Yegor couldn't understand why they were holding the wedding here instead of in the regional center. Looking out the window of the train, he thought about Nadia's groom, whom he had never met. He guessed the groom probably had some connection to farming, since the train dropped him about a kilometer away from the village. No one was there to meet him, so Yegor carried his luggage himself. He had packed light, knowing he didn't intend to stay in the village for more than 2 days. When Yegor reached his sister's house, he saw festive ribbons tied to the gate and small trees nearby. Preparations for the wedding were already in full swing. As he opened the gate, he noticed tables set up in the yard, which were empty for now but would soon be filled with dishes. "Hello, brother. I thought you weren't going to come," his sister called out from a distance. Yegor nodded awkwardly and walked into the house. His nostrils were immediately filled with the smell of delicious food being prepared for the celebration, according to village tradition. Yegor didn't recognize many of the people inside the house, but he assumed they were the groom's family or distant relatives. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it," Nadia said, leading him to his room. Since the wedding was the next day, Yegor had time to rest after the 4-hour train ride. Everything felt just like it had 10 years ago, he thought with a touch of sadness as he fell onto the bed. The house was old, with thick stone walls, wooden windows made from solid oak, and large, heavy doors. The roof was covered with green moss, and the chimney looked like it might collapse onto someone's head. Despite this, the house felt cozy. It had belonged to Nadia's parents, but after they died in an accident 5 years ago, Yegor's sister inherited it. Not wanting to be the center of attention, Yegor closed the door to his room. He already knew that tomorrow would be a hectic day since village weddings were noisy and pompous affairs. After a quick dinner his sister prepared, Nadia said, "You know, Styopka bought my wedding dress himself. Can you believe it? He guessed the size, color, and even the style. I love it." Yegor was surprised. "I thought brides usually choose their dresses." "Well, it turns out he picked it himself and it fits perfectly. How he guessed my size, I'll never know," Nadia said with a smile. After dinner, Yegor washed up in the yard and returned to the house as dusk fell. Lying on the hard bed, he tried desperately to sleep, but the unfamiliar surroundings kept him awake. Eventually, the village grew quiet. Dogs stopped barking, gates and shutters slammed shut, and the guests who had helped Nadia prepare for the wedding went home. Soon, the full moon rose, filling Yegor's room with a pale yellow light. In this eerie glow, everything looked different. Even a simple chair took on the shape of a monstrous figure on crooked legs. Yegor knew there was little to fear in the village. Everything was predictable and monotonous. In the past, there had been brawls between neighboring villages, but now most of the young people had left for the city. Without realizing it, Yegor drifted into sleep, too tired to even pull up a blanket. Despite the summer season, the proximity of the river made the nights cool. Curled up in a ball, he was grateful to finally fall asleep. But after midnight, Yegor woke up to a strange sound. At first, he thought he was dreaming. The noise reminded him of the grinding of a massive spider crawling along the wall. Yegor knew there couldn't be a beetle that large in the room, but the sound grew louder. Listening more closely, he realized it was coming from outside the house. What could that be? A cat? But why isn't it meowing? Yegor thought. He didn't consider himself easily scared, but this sound unsettled him. It grated on his ears and made him feel uncomfortable. The grinding continued, growing even louder, as if whatever was outside was trying to break into the house. Yegor carefully got out of bed and step by step headed towards the window. He wasn't thinking about anything mystical at the moment. As a city boy who had grown up surrounded by the skepticism of the urban jungle, his mind didn't wander into the realm of imagination. There was probably no one outside the window, and Yegor realized this because there wasn't even a shadow of a troublemaker in the yellow glare of the moon. But the grinding sound was coming from much lower than the windowsill. It seemed to be coming from the foundation. Maybe it was an animal. Rats, they say, can even gnaw through concrete. What if they were trying to dig a new tunnel? Yegor tried to cheer himself up. When he got closer to the window, he realized that whatever was scratching the foundation was much bigger than a rat. Yegor still couldn't see what was making the disgusting noise, but he knew he had to open the window to find out. Come on, it's easy, just one movement and you'll see for yourself, Yegor convinced himself. He wasn't particularly afraid. Deep down, he was a skeptic and didn't believe in village myths and legends, dismissing them as scary stories made up by grandmothers to frighten disobedient grandchildren. But when he opened the window, the scratching sound stopped for a moment. To see who was under the window, Yegor had to lean out and look down, yet something inside him didn't let him do it. Then, he heard a strange whisper, "Give it back. This is mine." Summoning his courage, Yegor took a deep breath and leaned out over the windowsill. The first thing he saw was a pair of eyes, dimly glowing in the moonlight. Then, he made out tangled, dirty hair, long unwashed and smelling like rotting straw. With just a quick glance, Yegor could tell that the figure in front of him was a woman. Her age was indeterminate. She could have been anywhere from 20 to 50 years old, especially since she was standing in the shadow of the house. The woman was on all fours, scratching at the foundation of the house with her nails. Her presence didn't seem to bother her at all. If anything, it seemed like Yegor's appearance encouraged her. The putrid smell of decay hit Yegor's nose, a stench he had only encountered once before in an abandoned garage, where he had found the decomposing body of a homeless man. This night visitor had the same awful smell. She occasionally growled like a dog as she scratched the foundation. Yegor began trembling uncontrollably. Suddenly, as if on command, the creature stopped scratching the wall and turned to look at him. To say that what Yegor saw was terrifying would be an understatement. Her face was mutilated, with part of her upper lip and several teeth missing. Deep scars ran along her cheeks, likely the work of corpse worms. Her yellow eyes oozed pus, and her forehead looked almost exposed down to the skull, as if she had been dragged along the asphalt by her legs. The creature stared at Yegor, her decayed eyes locking onto him. Then, she reached one of her decomposing hands toward him and rasped, "Give it to me. Can you hear it? It's mine." Yegor instinctively pulled back from the window, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. But the reality was worse than he could have ever imagined. The woman stood up, her head now level with the windowsill. Her pus-filled eyes followed Yegor as he backed away, paralyzed with fear. Despite her advanced state of decomposition, she moved surprisingly fast for someone who should have been long dead. Still not fully understanding the creature's purpose, Yegor scanned the room, searching for something he could use for self-defense. The rage in the creature's eyes blazed with madness, and Yegor, in desperation, grabbed a rickety wooden chair to shield himself from her fetid presence. It was a futile attempt. Yegor screamed in a voice that didn't sound like his own, hoping to alert his sister. Then, rising from the floor, he ran after the creature, which, after sweeping through the room like a storm, had made its way deeper into the house, where the unsuspecting occupants were sleeping. Yegor didn't know exactly where it had gone, but he knew it was dangerous. Hoping that his screams had woken Nadia, he rushed after the creature, turning on the lights as he went. He followed the foul stench left behind by the decomposing body. It was a living nightmare, its origins beyond his understanding. When Yegor reached the hallway, he saw something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The creature was standing with its back to him, reaching toward the closet where Nadia's wedding dress hung. It was a grotesque scene. With one swift motion, the dead woman ripped the closet door off its hinges. Nadia stood nearby, pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with terror. The creature growled and yanked the dress off the hanger. Then it turned to Yegor, its eyes full of madness, and began to stuff the dress into its throat. Yegor barely had time to blink before the decaying woman had forced half the dress down her throat. The thing was retching, but it kept pushing the dress inside, its throat expanding grotesquely to accommodate the fabric. Nadia, her face white as snow, stood frozen in shock. The dead woman took about 2 minutes to swallow the dress, retching and gagging along the way. Finally, she leapt toward the window in one jump, smashing through the glass and disappearing into the night. The only traces left behind were yellow pus and a vile, sickening smell lingering in the air. Nadia looked at Yegor, her expression full of disbelief. "I don't know what that was," Yegor said, still shaken. "It came through the window. And then you saw the rest." The rest of the night, neither of them slept. They sat in the kitchen, too afraid to go back to their rooms. "What will you do without a dress now?" Yegor asked. "I don't know," Nadia replied with a shudder. "I guess I'll wear something else." At dawn, brother and sister cleaned up the house, trying to forget the events of the night. They prepared for the wedding as best they could. Yegor knew that the official ceremony would take place at the regional center in one of the designated wedding halls. Only afterward would the bride and groom return to the village for the celebration. Yegor decided not to attend, but when the closest relatives got into the car, Nadia insisted he come with her. "Fine," Yegor muttered and sat in the back seat. At the wedding hall, everything went smoothly. The newlyweds signed the papers quickly and exchanged rings, sealing their union. After that, they took photographs for about an hour in specially designated places. Then, they began to gather back at the village table. Yegor refrained from drinking too much, as he was preoccupied with what had happened the night before. The guy couldn't understand why the night creature didn't harm them and only came for the dress, which it devoured in the most horrific way. At that moment, a thought flashed through his mind. It was the groom who had bought that very dress. Stepan had bought it without even knowing the exact size of his bride. What had initially seemed insignificant to Yegor now looked completely different. Seizing a moment when the groom was alone at the table, Yegor leaned closer and asked, "Why aren't you out there dancing?" "They've already started." Trying to make his voice sound more intoxicated, he continued, "But I don't like to dance," Stepan muttered in response. Yegor, however, was determined to find out more about the dress and where Stepan had bought it. When Yegor carefully asked about the dress, he saw a strange gleam in Stepan's eyes, as if he were debating whether to tell the truth. After weighing the pros and cons, Stepan finally answered, "I bought it from an old woman at the market, but keep it between us, okay?" "And you didn't even ask the old woman where it came from?" Yegor exclaimed. "Well, yeah, I just bought it. What's so special about it?" "The price was dirt cheap, and I only needed it for one day," Stepan replied. Only then did Yegor realize that this was likely a case of frugal peasant philosophy, saving money wherever possible. Stepan probably didn't mean any harm. He just saw an opportunity to cut costs for the wedding. Of course, Yegor himself would never buy something as important as a wedding dress secondhand, especially not from some old woman. "So, what's the name of this old woman?" Yegor asked cautiously. "I'm not sure. I think she's from the neighboring village, Kalachovka. Her house is on the border between two villages, but it doesn't belong to either of them," Stepan said, getting more into the conversation. After talking a little longer, Yegor realized that Stepan was a normal guy who had made an innocent mistake. Yegor wasn't in the mood to keep celebrating, especially since a risky thought had crossed his mind. Stepan mentioned that the old woman's house was only about 1.5 kilometers away. For a young guy like Yegor, that was nothing. Telling Stepan he was heading to his room to rest, Yegor quietly sneaked out. It was much faster this way, and in case anything happened, he could remain unnoticed. It was still early, and there were a few hours left before twilight. The old woman's house had an unpleasant look, its green moss-covered walls, a chimney leaning to one side, and filthy, long unwashed windows. The roof was so overgrown with moss that it was hard to spot the tiles beneath. Crouching down, Yegor approached the house carefully. After a minute, he rose on his toes and peered through one of the windows. To his surprise, there was no one inside. Maybe Stepan was mistaken, Yegor thought, but as he looked closer, he noticed utensils on the table with some kind of food. The house was clearly lived in, but where was the old woman? Perhaps she had gone into the forest to pick berries, Yegor thought. If that were the case, he could easily enter the house and search it. As he suspected, the door was unlocked. Stepping inside, Yegor winced at the smell. It wasn't the stench of decay, but something faintly unsettling, like what you'd smell if a mouse or small rat had died. The inside of the house was surprisingly bare. Just a table, a bed, and 2 creaky chairs. Realizing there wasn't much to see, Yegor decided to leave. But just then, he heard a strange noise coming from beneath the floor. Yegor froze and listened closely. The sound was a muffled murmur coming from underground. Glancing around, Yegor spotted a trapdoor leading to a cellar. A wild thought crossed his mind. The sensible thing to do would be to leave and pretend he had never been there. But contradicting his instincts, Yegor slowly lifted the trapdoor and peered inside. There was a narrow, rickety staircase leading down. Yegor didn't want to descend, but the mysterious murmur compelled him. The words were barely discernible, and he doubted they were even human. Step by step, Yegor made his way down the creaking stairs. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he froze in horror. In the middle of the room lay a coffin, covered in mold, containing the skeletal remains of a woman dressed in a tattered wedding gown. Yegor immediately recognized the dress. It was the same one Stepan had given to Nadia. An old woman was pacing around the coffin, muttering to herself. Her voice sent chills down Yegor's spine. She seemed oblivious to his presence, deep in some kind of trance. Her voice grew louder, and the air in the room became thick, as if scorched by an unseen flame. Yegor's gaze drifted to the corpse in the coffin, and he couldn't believe his eyes. The skeleton was regenerating. Skin and muscle began to form rapidly, tendons and veins twisting together like cords. Trembling, Yegor looked up just as the old woman turned her gaze toward him. "You shouldn't have come here, boy," she said coldly. "The bride can't be saved, and the groom was a fool. This is an ancient spell, so old that no one remembers its name. My daughter died a year ago, on her wedding day. A common food allergy caused her to suffocate, and she died in this very dress. The groom married again a year later, but my Katya can't be brought back. I've searched long and hard for a way to resurrect her." "And what did you do?" Yegor asked, his voice trembling. "I did nothing," the old woman replied, a wicked smile spreading across her face. "I simply sold my dead daughter's dress to that fool. The bride tried it on, unknowingly giving her life force to my daughter. I dug up Katya and performed the ritual. After that, my Katya took her dress and put it on from the coffin, staring at him with a mindless gaze." Yegor still didn't realize that, at that very moment, his sister Nadia could drop dead at the wedding table. What the old woman had in mind was so horrific and inhuman that it made his teeth gnash. She had slipped her dead daughter's dress to the groom, intending to take the life of an innocent bride. Realizing this, Yegor, in an instant, flew up the rickety stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut. He began piling anything he could find onto the lid, trying to block it. When he ran out of things to use from inside the house, he dragged stones in from outside, dumping them on the trapdoor, desperately trying to ignore the old woman's hand scraping at the door beneath. He worked for 2 hours, blocking the underground passage, all the while trying not to think about the possibility that the undead daughter would eventually devour her half-mad mother out of hunger. When Yegor finally returned to the village, his heart was heavy with fear. He was terrified that he'd find his sister dead. But as he entered the house, the mournful expressions on the people's faces told him that something terrible had happened. "She's dead, isn't she? Nadia is dead." Yegor screamed in grief, collapsing to his knees. His sorrow was so intense that everyone present involuntarily shuddered. At that moment, Stepan's heavy hand fell on Yegor's shoulder. "Stop it, buddy. She's alive. She just fainted. Your sister is pregnant." Tears welled up in Yegor's eyes as he realized that the old woman's plan had failed. His sister was alive, and not only that, she was going to have a baby who would be Yegor's nephew in 9 months. Yegor preferred not to think about what had become of the old woman and her daughter. It was only many years later that Nadia told Yegor that the old woman's house had burned down, taking all its terrible, nightmarish secrets with it into the ashes.